Welcome to the Leadership School podcast. I'm your host, leadership and self-care coach, Kyla Cofer. Here at the Leadership School, you'll hear leaders from around the world sharing their stories and expertise on how to lead with balance and integrity. Our goal? Teach you how to be an extraordinary leader. Joining me today is McKenna Sweazey. McKenna is a remote and hybrid management work expert focusing on digital empathy. She has spent her career working in global organizations from corporates to startups and managing remote teams around the world. She is currently the VP of marketing at a data startup in Silicon Valley. On today's episode, she'll be teaching us how to refine communication skills and build relationships, whether you're in person or on a screen 6,000 miles away. Anchor Podcast is the easiest way to make a podcast. Not only is it free, but it has everything you need, including creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. For me, in just a few minutes, I was able to go from an idea to a reality of having my podcast launched and out there. Anchor not only distributes your podcast for you on all platforms, but it has everything you need in one place. You can download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. I'm really grateful that you would join me for the Leadership School, and just thanks so much for being here.
Yeah.
And let's just dive right in and get started. So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So hi, I'm McKenna Sweazey. I am an author and coach in the world of remote and hybrid work. And my expertise and my focus is in digital empathy. And digital empathy is taking empathy, so being able to understand the feelings and emotions of another person. And how do we do that digitally? And what clues and indicators are we getting digitally that are different or the same? And how can we use that information, particularly in the workplace, to get along better with our colleagues, to be a better manager, to get things done more effectively? You know, how does this allow us to be better in the workplace? So that's what I write and focus and coach on.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk to you about this because I had never heard the term digital empathy before, and it makes total sense. And especially that we would be talking about it now within this pandemic where we're all using technology. A lot of us are working remotely, and it's a whole different environment that you're still having to engage with people in.
Exactly. And half of it's the same. We're all people on the other end of that camera. And then half of it's completely different. You sat next to someone in an office. You got so many indicators about their mood, their vibe, their outside life from things you could see. And now you can see this little avatar on Slack and a picture on your screen for 2 hours a day. You know, it's just far less information to build a relationship with. So it really changes how we get along and how we get things done in the office.
Yeah. So digital empathy, if I'm understanding this correctly, then is being able to have that same type of empathy that you would have for a person, but being able to do it through a screen.
Through a screen. And I think one distinction that's really important to me is that, so for a lot of psychologists, there's 3 kinds of empathy: cognitive, compassionate, and sympathetic. Sympathetic is feeling the emotion with the other person. Compassionate is a desire to fix it. Cognitive is what I like to think about, which is really the ability to understand, or to the best of your ability, of course, what the other person is feeling. The idea that you have to be affected by it isn't really necessary to what I'm thinking about. That's important to being a human, but in the workplace, it may not be appropriate. It's just a sort of a different delineation that we think, okay, what are you thinking and how's that going to affect how I now react to you?
Yes. So spell out a little bit more than you're kind of headed there already, but spell out a little bit more the differences between having empathy in like right now, we're actually remote. We're having this conversation.
Exactly.
You're on the West Coast. I'm in Tennessee. And so what are the differences between empathy over a screen versus in person?
So I think, I mentioned a few of these, but let's dive deeper. So one, and just like some examples, you don't have as much context, right? Because you're spending far less time with people. So like an example is you're sitting next to your coworker and they get in a fight on the phone with their mother-in-law and you hear it. And then they're kind of gruff with you a few minutes later, but you've already heard this conversation because you've been sitting next to them all day and you saw their body language change. You saw their tone change. And so you have the context when the next thing comes out of their mouth, and maybe in a pure vacuum, it would have sounded a little gruff, but you know that he's just had this fight with his mother-in-law. In a virtual world or in a virtual office, you don't have that context in a lot of situations. There's things happening to us all day long, and all I'm getting is this 1 hour of your time in a meeting. So that's one thing. The other is that obviously any nonverbal cues you do have are muted. People's hand gestures, this isn't a video stream, but you only see like half of my hand gestures if I happen to gesticulate a lot. And that's if I do have my camera on. If I have my camera off, you don't get any of that nonverbal cues except for the ones from my voice. And the ones from your voice are very important. Pace of speech, modulation, pitch. These are all telling a story, but it's not as vibrant the story as your entire body is telling. Not to mention what people wear is telling a story about how they identify themselves. You get a little bit of that, but definitely not the whole thing over video conference. And then lastly, when we think about text-based communication, which particularly for asynchronous work, which remote work kind of demands for a lot of people, it's a blessing and a curse. There's the assumption that there's less emotion involved in the way things are written. The truth of the matter is that isn't true at all. We do pick up each other's emotions, studies have shown, from just the way emails and text messages are written, and you can understand, passive aggression, anger, etc. And so that's one aspect, sort of unintentional, but things that you can't help but do over email. And then there's everyone's ability to write is different, and ability to convey themselves in the written word is certainly not equal across the board. And a lot of our evolution to, say, Slack or using Jira boards or Trello, I don't think has come with like enough etiquette guidance or like the social constructs that would tell us how do we behave in these arenas now to convey emotions or, the backstory effectively, or not keep it totally neutral. That's also an option. But we don't really have constructs to do that yet, which we did have tons of social constructs to tell you how to behave in an office.
Yeah. So is it kind of like we have a need to put the humanity back in technology? Like,
absolutely.
The technology is great and a great resource, but there's that human portion that is really hard to grasp when you're not standing in front of somebody.
Exactly.
So it's digital empathy would be finding the ways to put that humanity back in. So how do we do that? I mean, this is, you wrote a whole book on it. It's a lot. So where do we start?
Well, I think everyone starts with themselves. It's really hard if you're not on your own best self to be able to gauge other people's best selves. So, understanding what you're giving off, how do your moods impact how you react in the office, sort of checking in with yourself and saying, like, did that email come off in the right way? If I'm in a bad mood, should I maybe hold off on leaving that voicemail or writing that email? You can copy emails that you've written when you were in a good mood and use them to check your tone and choice of words to make sure that when you're in a bad mood, if you have to write an email, you can also absent yourself, right? Because it's easy to turn off your camera and kind of like get away from something if you're not going to be bringing your best self. So it definitely starts with yourself and understanding your own moods and what you're giving off in the office, because bad moods are
paying attention and being aware.
Yeah, exactly. And being aware. And two is really giving a focus to this and saying, so what clues am I getting from my coworkers? And being a little bit more cognizant, and whether that requires frameworks and checklists to say, every time I talk to Kyla, she's sitting in one spot and she nods her head in a certain way. But today I noticed she's doing something different. Should I ask her about that? Just sort of priming yourself to remember that those far fewer cues that you're getting mean something. They could also mean nothing, but you want to be the kind of person who's looking for changes in people's behavior, who's looking for opportunities to say, is everything okay? Is it something good? Is it something bad? Not everyone wants to share. We don't have to invade each other's personal space, but trying to remind yourself to pick up the cues you have, because empathy is a learned skill. Some of it's innate. It comes from our monkey ancestors. It comes from babies bonding with their mothers. Being able to read facial expressions, but we have to retrain now to do it through a screen.
And learn how to deliver those messages when we're looking at ourselves, learn how to deliver those messages effectively. So yeah, like you're saying, consider your good mood, consider your mood, consider your environment before sending that message.
Well, I was thinking about, I talk about feedback and how if you gave a presentation in a meeting and we walk out of the meeting together, and I'm your manager and I say, that went really, really well. I loved how you did X, Y, and Z. One thing you might have done is do this a little bit differently. Generally, it was pretty good. That's one way to give feedback. If I have to schedule a meeting with you because we've closed out Zoom and you've walked away from your computer after that, that takes on a whole new tenor. It's more serious. And sometimes feedback requires a serious moment, but sometimes it doesn't require a serious moment. And it can feel like far harsher criticism, depending on how you contextualize it. Just taking that into account about how you deliver it.
Well, I'm just sitting here thinking too, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you don't have those outside conversations to rebuild relationships if there's been harm done. But also sometimes you might wonder, okay, what's that person saying behind my back when I'm not in the screen?
And humans have a very common and very normal tendency to take a lack of information and assume it's negative. So if you have a manager who's not checking in with you that often and you used to sit next to them and get smiles and hays and whatever, and those would be positive reinforcement. And now you're getting almost none and a bi-weekly check-in. You might think that your relationship isn't good. And so you start building this narrative of a negative relationship and that they aren't approving of your work. And for many managers, that neutrality to them is, you're doing fine. It's fine. I have nothing to say to you because everything's going so well. And so for managers, remembering that absence of information can really be seen as a negative. That's also a huge thing, that these check-ins are so meaningful in terms of the relationship, even if almost no work information is conveyed.
Oh, wow. I never thought about that too, just having a Zoom meeting just to connect. I mean, we don't need to talk about work. Let's just have 10 minutes once a week just to say hello and make sure that we're seeing each other or something, or sending it. I'm hearing over communicate. Yes. That it would be better to over communicate, check in with Slack, whatever your tools that you're using, but to really hone in on those communication skills.
Yeah. I think over communicating is key. Finding ways to layer the communication, because obviously, as we've discussed, written is like the lowest bar. If I show you a 10-second or 3-second clip from The Office, you know what I mean, despite people having generational debates about this in the office. These are things that tell people what you're feeling and what your emotions are, and they are very clear, right? And so we do have some resources to make it more rich. And to say in that little way, I'm thinking of you, I'm making a joke, my feelings towards you are positive. And that is very important, both for colleagues and for managers in their reports.
Being open about communication and not being afraid to embrace like a possible conflict.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, conflict is a whole different, it's a whole different beast. I'm talking about when things are going well. When things are going poorly, whew.
Well, how do we approach things that are going poorly when you're on a screen? How do you have those difficult conversations? And I'm thinking, how do you end them? I mean, because you're like, okay, we just had this awkward moment, and now we can't just walk away or leave the room. We have to turn the screen off. And
is that where I hit the button? Am I hitting the button?
Yeah.
And this is hard for everyone. But you can go in more prepared because you do have a buffer. Very rarely, though it does happen, there's much more scheduling going on. So things don't as often hit you out of left field, though we all know it still happens. You can go in more prepared. You do have to have the agency in the moment to say, okay, now, we need to end this conversation. I had this funny experience recently in a coffee shop of hearing someone have a very tense conversation with what appeared to be their manager. And the manager was very clearly, even though I do not know this person, having a bad day. They were sort of reiterating what the person had done wrong. And it didn't sound like a very big deal to me, but they obviously, and they had a lot of emotion in their voice about it. And I was thinking, wow, this person who's listening, he's just really good at letting this roll on. And I wanted to go over and ask him, but I didn't, how it made him feel afterwards to get this conversation that went on too long. And he, not that it would have been different in real life, but he didn't have the opportunity to say, okay, I've actually got to go. I'm in a coffee shop, which is probably what he should have said. I'm in a coffee shop. Other people can hear you. And that would have been a great excuse to get out of the conversation. But yes, things can go on. There's no boundaries, but you can fake your boundaries a little bit better. You can say the Amazon guys just arrived. And now we need to end this conversation because belaboring the point doesn't usually make feedback better.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't. Just repeating it over and over and over, and then emphasizing it on a different forum, sending an email about how it went and how poorly it went, or putting it on your CRM. And I'm hearing a lot of communication themes with you that it's more communication and better communication, that we need all of those things.
Yes, exactly. And I think more thoughtfulness about communication. I think we need to say, this is what Slack is for. And so Slack is like such a good example because it is a news feed. And in our social media lives, we've had a lot of discussion as a society about what a news feed is and how it can actually not be great, right? It's sort of like a never-ending churn of information. Not to mention at my current role at a startup, messages tend to get lost. And particularly for like different people, they're not going to see them. And so actually Slack has like lost all utility for some people because the volume of messages they're getting means that any one that requires an action is like kind of problematic. So we have this work news feed. And then I've also been at bigger companies where you have a lot of people sharing a lot of different things. And it's very fun, but it can be considered invasive. So, how often do you expected to check it if you're getting this like sort of torrent? And do you have to be a part of the pet channel because everyone else is a part of a pet channel? I'm not really a pet person. Now I feel sort of left out because there's a pet channel at work, but I don't have a dog. So anyways, that's tribalism at work for you. But anyways, being thoughtful about Slack and saying, is Slack synchronous or asynchronous? That's a spectrum that is huge for remote work. Obviously, email is asynchronous. You do not expect a response in real time. Meetings are the absolute definition of synchronous, and everything is happening at one time. And where does Slack fall? Because you probably need an SLA or a service level agreement or any agreement on what do we use this for? How quickly do you have to respond? And that's probably true for email as well.
Would you recommend that companies, organizations, leaders, as they're looking at this digital environment, that they have some sort of a meeting or a policy or training on these are our protocols for communication remotely, even in the office? If you have an office and you have Slack, like these are the protocols. We don't discuss other team members behind each other's back or whatever those are. But to have a training policy, a system of this is how we operate in this space.
Absolutely. And I think it's a part of culture and a part of defining a team's culture. When you think of like the outward manifestation of culture, some of it's like hours worked. Some of it's like, is this an organization where people curse or don't curse? Is it in a place where we kind of celebrate failures? Or is it a place where we're like, very harsh on people failing and it's more perfectionist oriented? And in a vacuum, none of those things are bad, but they definitely make up what kind of environment we're working in. And the way we use communication tools is a part of that. So I think I think everyone would say that culture in remote work is much harder. And you do have some of these passive buildups of culture, which one big one is how we use our communication tools and how we connect with each other, because that's all we have now to build culture. So yes, absolutely. I think it's part of like a culture manifesto and saying this is who we are and this is how we communicate. And this is the tools we use to get what done.
So I think you just said them, but I want to like bullet point them for my own mind. If I was going to create a policy for this is how we interact, what would be the top 3 things that you would say need to be included in that policy? So you said, it's because you're creating the culture. So you said something about whether or not we swear.
I don't know if that's a top 3. I think, so this is like not really an answer to your question, but it's sort of the framework I would start with like prior to that, which is that all the tools we use to communicate have kind of 3 major aspects to them. Synchronicity, asynchronous versus synchronous, nonverbal cues, and who's in it, one-to-one and many-to-many. Meeting is many-to-many, mm-hmm. And a text message is one-to-one. Obviously, those are both spectrums. And so we can say that given those constraints, this is how we're going to communicate with each other. And you have to put your tools kind of in those buckets or mapping them along those axes and say, if something is synchronous communication, this is kind of the response time we require. If it's asynchronous, this is kind of an acceptable response time. So that's one. Who gets included when we're talking about one-to-one and many-to-many, I think a huge issue in many organizations is meeting overload. Something like managers' meeting hours went up like 54% during the pandemic.
Wow.
And some of that is because without like in general meeting, you have to have meetings to connect and to get synchronous work done. And some of it's fear. You don't want to leave people out. So kind of, again, defining who gets invited to things and why, and having a playbook to say, this is how we make those decisions. And this is what we put in the agenda to let it be clear who's there. Are they required to be there? Are they informed when they're there? What's their purpose in being there? Being more transparent about that allows you to leave people off because it's clear why they're being left off. And if they then need to make a case, at least they can make a case aligned with why someone thinks they're holding the meeting in the first place. So that did not really answer your question, but
no, it did. Because I heard make it clear the time commitments. Like, are we responding now? Like the time constraints. Are we responding now? Can we wait? When are your expectations? So it's really a setting up of expectations for time. And then people setting up the expectations of who's involved, who's not involved, why or why not. Really making sure, again, that over communicating. So you're not like, oh, all of us are going to have a meeting except for Susan over there. And then Susan's like, why am I not part of the team? Oh, she finds out 2 days later, you guys all had a meeting, What about recording meetings? Is that helpful to record things and then say, oh, I couldn't make it, so let me watch the recording? Is that beneficial?
Talk about something that is cultural. Yes, it is beneficial, but it makes people uncomfortable. And I think you really have to have a top-down decision about whether it's something you do. There are a lot of software now, and this happens in Zoom and in everything else, where you can get a written transcript. Which is obviously far less invasive than recording someone and saving it. People can find that uncomfortable. And if you're trying to get people to put their cameras on, even more uncomfortable. So, I'm hesitant to record everyday meetings for that reason. I think it can be a little big brother. That being said, obviously, like all hands and companies that are large and they really can't get things done across time zone, you need to make announcements. Yes, it should be done. But that really generally puts leadership more on stage, and that's sort of an expected part of the role as opposed to just, everyone having their workflow recorded. But some places are extremely transparent and they're happy to do that. And it is a part of their culture, and you join with that expectation. And if they are upfront about that, then that can work really well for people, as long as it's
make that clear in your hiring processes as your
Exactly. Are you attracting the kind of people who align with your culture? Which goes back to, if you are prescriptive about your culture and acknowledge how it actually impacts people's day to day, you can say like, we're people first. Well, what does people first mean? And there's probably some very clear examples of what people first means for organizations that really walk the walk. And being able to explain those in the hiring process is great. And saying these are like actually how it impacts like our maternity leave policy or our grief policy. So yes. And, I was thinking when you said, time, how much time and who should be invited, the last one is goal. When we think about communication tools, what's the goal of this communication tool? So if you think about like project management software, it can be pretty obvious. I'm using a Trello board or a Jira board to get something done. The point is that we are going to move all those tasks to have a work output. So that's relatively clear. But email, maybe a little less clear. Like, why do we use email over Slack? Certainly, they both have really similar abilities. And then a meeting. Why are we having a meeting? That's a question that needs to be asked in every office all the time. And there are obviously very distinct reasons why you have to have a meeting for this. So being really clear about why you're using one tool over another and why that tool is the right tool for that.
So just giving it some thought, not just like jumping in and just using everything because it exists and it's available, but actually giving it some thought and having some purpose and meaning behind it can really make a difference in how well your company, your organization operates and communicates and progresses.
Absolutely.
Well, you mentioned hiring. I mean, when you're hiring in a remote environment, how does that affect how you interview people?
This is probably the topic I've spoken about the most for whatever reason. And I do love to talk about it. And I actually think it's becoming less and less of a thing. This is the work we're going to do. We're going to do it at our computer screens over Zoom. And so your ability to communicate clearly, to answer effectively, to give off the persona that you are going to give off in the office. And is that someone I want to work with? Is it someone I feel an ability to commiserate with, or to get things done with? That's no different than how it's going to be. You may never meet your coworkers in the office. So I think for interviewers, the company that the hiring manager, let's say, it probably requires being even more confident that you can measure the skills you're looking for in an interview, because work has become more output oriented, and what you are getting from someone is really what they're going to be outputting in remote work. And for an interviewer, then it's just, do my skills match this work? And am I communicating that effectively and confidently? So I think actually the onus is more on the hiring manager to say, what is it that I need? Because I am not getting the same degree of social interaction from this person. So it doesn't matter maybe as much that you like them or that you feel a kinship, which is great for diversity. You have a far more limited reasoning to say, oh, this person went to my university, so I like them more. Can they get it done? Which is great.
Are they the right role? Are they the right person for this role, instead of this is the right person for the office environment and culture? But also you have to still communicate with, is this the right person that can communicate effectively via Slack and via email and have Zoom meetings and show up with, and whatever they have going on in the background and all those things.
Exactly.
I mean, how do you make your argument? How do you make yourself more persuasive in a conversation over Zoom?
So we all grew up, most of us, watching television, and there's the clue. When you're on screen, you have to have snappy storytelling, right? And there's a reason that we love watching Friends, and it's 22 minutes, and there's quite the story arc, and there's a beginning and a middle and an end. And that's what you have to do. You have to tell your stories in both a more structured fashion, and really beginning, middle, and end. There's that public speaking adage, which is tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. The STAR method: situation, task, action, result. There's a lot of ways.
Wait, I don't know that one. Say that one again.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
They call it STAR: situation, task, action, result. So it's just a way of like saying, what was happening, what I did, and what happened because of what I did. So all of this is to say, you really need a structure. But my cheesy reflection on this is that you need to be a star, because you have to modulate your pitch. You have to get excited, but you have to speak like a newscaster, carefully, with the right word choice, without ums and ahs, because you don't have anything else to convey. You only really have the words coming out of your mouth.
So really being clear and direct, like we don't need a 30-minute story of this one project or item or task or how you got there. Let's just tell me that you got there and move it along.
Keep it snappy.
I might need more preparation for that then. Like if I'm having a Zoom meeting, instead of just hopping on a meeting, that might be part of my protocol of, well, we only schedule meetings with a 24-hour notice, because that someone might need to think through, okay, how do I explain this, where I'm at, a little bit more clearly, and make sure that I have answers to the questions, so that I'm not sitting around going, well, I don't know.
Exactly. Though I wonder, in today's hiring market, I feel like if you're looking, you got to be prepared to just get on that call and tell your story. But you're right, giving people more time to be more prepared. And I think that's something in remote work generally, meetings function far more effectively if people go in prepared, if the agenda is extremely clear, if the background reading materials are prepared in advance, and if the goal is sort of stated, this is what we are going to walk away with. But that requires that the people going to the meeting read that, act on it, and go in like, yeah, I am going to decide whether or not we're going to allocate the learning and development budget to Excel training next year. And I think that change, that's a sea change. Saying, yes, you do have more freedom in remote work, but you need to really come at it in that different way. And I think there are definitely organizations who are doing wonderfully at this. But it's a different way of working than I think some people are used to. And the disconnect then of the people who go in extremely prepared, or the people who set up meetings with like a lot of uncertainty around them, that can be a real disconnect at this point.
So would you send that agenda via email or Slack or post it on your Trello board?
Everywhere. Agenda goes everywhere.
Make sure they see it.
Yeah, exactly.
Having a screen and having a meeting, we're using Zoom because that's like, I would say arguably the most popular choice, but there are several other. So you have the issue of a screen and a camera that we're not used to. I have the issue that my face always shows up in the middle, and that if I'm looking at the screen, I'm like looking down. And so I'm not actually looking at the person and engaging with them. But if I look at the camera, I'm missing all the verbal cues. So can you talk about that just a little bit? Some of that like practical basic. I mean, how do you get used to that?
Yeah. And I think that, this is like rewriting thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of human ability to look at someone's face and to know what of my face you're seeing. And I think the very common first piece of advice is to turn off your camera. But that's tough because then I don't know what you can see. And in the real world, I know exactly what you can see when we're talking. And I know where your eyes are and what you're focusing on. But if I can't see me, then I can't tell if now obviously listeners to this podcast cannot tell, but like I'm halfway off the screen. And I need to know that. And are my hand gestures, because every time you switch from Zoom to Google Hangouts to Microsoft Teams, the camera depth is a little bit different. So there's no getting used to like, oh, I can gesticulate like this, but I can't gesticulate more widely because it's going to be different next time I sign on to something. So that's really frustrating. So I think it's important probably to get a check with your self view and then try and turn it off. I'm so guilty of not turning it off because I do. And this comes, I wrote a book about digital empathy. I'm obviously obsessed with empathy. And so I want to know what people are getting from me. And then how are they reacting to that? And that can be really hard if you can't tell what they're seeing. So that's one problem.
Yeah. And that's a little bit different than in person. Like when you're in person, you're not seeing yourself when someone talks, but if your hair is out of place or if that person's staring at like the giant pimple on your face or the mustard stain on your shirt or they're distracted because the bus just went by in the background. You have all those cues that you don't get on a screen. Plus, when you're looking at yourself, it can be harder to be focused on what the other person is saying. But also then you can pay attention to something. It's just there's so many things happening that we're not thinking about.
And looking at yourself is one of the most bandwidth draining things ever. We're human beings. Mirrors stop people for a reason. So being able to look at yourself is takes away so much of your computing power. So that is an issue. And you do have to turn off your self view at some point for that reason, unless you have extreme powers of self-control, which let's just assume no one does.
I don't. I always turn my self view off. I have to be able to engage with the other people.
That is one. And it's the kind of the first piece of advice for a lot of reasons. I just think it's like so easy to say, and then it misses this kind of like concept of the back and forth that people are giving. So that's numero uno. And then the next one, I think, is positioning your squares in a way that is most aligned to the camera. And so that you can toggle between looking up and looking down. From the person's face to making eye contact. It's easier if you're sort of presenting and you're talking. You can really say, I'm having this moment where I'm going for the camera, and then be able to switch back to the looking. Finding a preference in general, what squares along the screen work for me and who do I want to look at? Again, this is me. I'm obsessed with these things, and I am constantly choosing to look at different people in the meeting because I'm reading their facial expressions and I'm wondering, what is she thinking about that? Did he just react to that? That's kind of weird. And that's me. And that's a kind of a benefit because you can do that extremely subtly and no one knows that you're staring at the audience, not the speaker. So that's another element. I think we'll also see camera technology change. We have to. This is not going to cut it, and it's really not going to cut it when we go back to hybrid. And you have office conference rooms that were kitted out for what was an acceptable way of having a call. But now if you have half the people on the screen and half the people in the room, that makes a lot of demands on the way the cameras are and the way the microphones are.
How do you do that when you do have a hybrid model? How do you build a healthy office culture when you have people there and people not there? And making sure that you are over communicating, but that can be hard because you might remember, oh, I told Matt because he's sitting next to me, but I didn't tell Melanie because she's not there. How do you do that?
Yeah, so I think that you have to kind of default to the remote first as best you can. And two, I think it involves particularly for people who have knowledge power or who are managers, and so they have that asymmetrical access to knowledge and they know things first. They have to be extremely cognizant. And the moment you say it to Matt in the office is that you have to slack it to Melanie because that ability to transfer the information asymmetrically can be extremely unfair. I do think where this is going to be hiccup laden, because as much as like you can be cognizant of that problem and be aware and want to do your best, there's a natural human nature to doing this, and proximity bias is real and it's huge. And we do like people more the more we are exposed to them. And so if you see someone in an office, you're going to like them more than the person you only see for 2 hours a week on Zoom.
So that would go back to some of your communication policies that you're creating and that training right from the bat of just because you're here, that other person is still fully a part of our team just because they're not here, but they live on the other side of this country. And time zones play a factor in there too, but we have to always defer to that person, communicate with them. That person has to be in the loop at all times. That also ties into how do we build relationships with people we're not seeing? Like, how do we celebrate when we can't go out to dinner together, or we can't go out for after our happy hour drinks? How do we do that? I've been asking this question for a while, and I asked this of all teams of how can you as a team find more ways to celebrate and to build relationships when we're not in each other's faces?
And I think the long answer is going to be even remote work is going to require in-person bonding. Obviously, as we are currently still dealing with COVID, that is maybe not on the table for a lot of organizations. I think it's something I've thought a lot about and really spent a lot of time trying to quantify, what are the types of team building that work for different environments? And this also, I think, defaults to remote first. So if you're going to do some of these more intimate team buildings, the one that kind of get really into people's core, like there's an activity called life mapping that people often reference. I don't know if you've done it, where you kind of go through it can be done in different ways, but you draw like a linear map of your life and the 3 points that are the highest above the baseline and the 3 moments that are the lowest below the baseline. And that's very sharing. This is not appropriate for all teams, but there are instances where, this is a very bonding experience, but you have to do this remotely or in person. There's no hybrid because you cannot have a situation where people are sort of getting more nonverbal information in that situation. And for some people, it might be more intimate over a screen, and they're going to be, if they are over the screen and you're in person, they'll feel sort of on the back foot, and vice versa, having to say that in front of your coworkers, but possibly you cry. And then there's someone in a screen and they feel kind of distant. That can make it very unequal. So you have to do things like that, really sort of default to remote first. I think there are a lot of activities that have been designed and will be designed that allow people to bond online. There's a lot of gaming going on, metaverse type stuff that allows you to compete and collaborate because a lot of team building stuff has always been sort of competitive type, company softball leagues, going out for mini golf. I've even done axe throwing, surprisingly competitive, paintballing. All these things these are actually quite easy to recreate virtually and have something that is equally engaging and fun and unique. Because there's so much technology built around that kind of like fun gaming type stuff. And then I think one thing you mentioned is like the delight factor and really going out to celebrate. And one example I gave in my book, and it's my favorite way that we have to think about how to evolve this, is I worked at a newspaper and we'd hit a subscriber number and they filled the lobby with balloons with that number. And that is delightful. You come in and you're like, you're so excited to be a part of the team. So how do we do that? I know. It's great to hit milestones as a company. It reminds you why you're there and what you're all working towards. And so you have to find ways, because putting that in Slack, as we've discussed, in that long running news feed of information, boring, gone, over.
Or just like a balloon emoji that does not anywhere that seems
Not quite the
significant.
same. But we do have technological advancements. So does IT take over everyone's home screen with the information, and sort of invade your computer in a way, it's not quite as engaging, but it's better. I think sending physical swag home, sending treats, sending experiences that people can do together, virtual, like a painting class, something where you actually do something, is more fun. Sitting around having a virtual happy hour, I think after the pandemic, no one's ever going to want to do that ever again.
No, but I would do a painting class, or I know that there are virtual cooking classes. You could send everybody a box and your team of the same ingredients, and have a cooking class or something like that.
I had a job with a company and they were based in London. I have cooked breakfast at 6 a.m. to match. And then there's, someone in Hong Kong cooking it at dinner at whatever, 11 p.m. there or far later. So anyways, yes, it's the bigger the remote distance, the bigger the consequences.
Do a lot of companies put this in their budget as ways to actually gather in person? Like once a year, we're going to buy you a flight and you're going to come to our home office and we're going to bring people together and we want to see your face. We want to shake your hand.
Yeah. And I think publicly that's what a lot of companies have said. If we are just Xing out that line item that was rent, which was not insignificant, and many of the itinerant costs that go with that, that should be part of the travel budget. And, you said once a year. I think once a year is probably not nearly enough. Maybe for the whole company, sure. But if you want to really build that rapport, once a year isn't going to cut it.
Well, if you think about it, even if you're buying an expensive long haul ticket, that's still cheaper than having to hire and train a whole new employee because you weren't engaging your staff.
Exactly. If you think about it as a cost of retention, and retention is, as a manager, the most important thing. How much can I grow the people I have, and how much can I take advantage of that institutional knowledge to do better? It's expensive to lose someone.
Sure. Wow. This is all really, really helpful. I'm just shaping, as I'm building my own business and consulting, that as I do that I want to really be thinking through, okay, what policies do I have about Slack and email? And I've not really done that. I've just kind of let things go as they go, but I can see the value in having it spelled out a little bit more, because then you have the people on the same page, you have people working more cohesively and building those relationships intentionally, like it does take a little bit more effort to build relationships when you're not around. But sometimes I don't know, I guess that would be the beauty of it. That means like, I actually am making an effort to get to know you.
Exactly. But the company, if you're talking about particularly in a larger corporate, you have to build in that time and give people like the freedom and the benefit to do that, to build those relationships. It is certainly, there's been numerous studies about the benefits to having people having like wider networks at different companies and transferring knowledge from different geographies and abilities and skill sets. The deeper people's networks go, like productivity and engagement are both like massively increased. And so pretending that this will just be okay if we don't underscore it and make an effort is probably a pretty terrible management technique. Yeah, so definitely. I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head. We just have to be more thoughtful and more transparent. We haven't talked about working hours, and, particularly with parents at home with small children, being really obvious about your working hours and saying, this is when I work and this is when I don't, is so helpful. When you think about like are you going to respond to me or not? Well, I pick up my kids and I do, mommy time from 3 to 7. So no, in that time period, I don't respond. But I sign back on from 8 to 9, and that's when you can expect my response. That changes how your colleagues perceive you. Now you're not slow to respond. You've given them the context to understand when you're going to respond.
And let them know that they don't just need to sit around and wait for you, but that expectations, like when you have appropriate and healthy expectations and know how to manage those well and have those in a team and organizational setting, it can completely change the trajectory of where you are going.
Exactly.
Awesome. Oh, this is just really, really helpful. I feel like I have 1,000 more questions for you. But one thing I wanted to ask you too, since we were talking about Zoom, just quickly, I have heard a lot of people talking about Zoom fatigue. Now, I'm not familiar with this term because I have used Zoom for years and years and years, and it's just been a normal thing for me and it doesn't tire me out, but I don't use it all day long. So how can you explain a little bit more to me what Zoom fatigue is? How do we avoid it and prepare for that and work within that?
Well, the worst thing is that Zoom fatigue disproportionately affects women. Studies have found they find it harder to switch between meeting to meeting at that rapid pace for whatever reason. I think people might allege that women are more naturally empathetic, so you have more signals that you're trying to read, and that takes up a lot of bandwidth. Great Economist article on this I will not go into. So I think there's a couple of really important things that contribute to Zoom fatigue. So one is the bandwidth. As I said, your body and your brain is racing to create the same amount of information and the richness of information that you get from an in-person conversation from that little screen on your computer. So that takes up a lot of your cognitive bandwidth that you could be using to, think other more productive thoughts. That's exhausting. Two, if you don't go from meeting room to meeting room, you're sitting all day and you're sitting in one position, which is one sedentary. And in a normal office space, you might be in meetings all day, but they're usually scheduled in different conference rooms. And we've all been to like all day trainings, and that is very tiring because it feels kind of nonstop. There's no getting up to move around. So that physical sedentariness. And then lastly, the banality of sitting at your desk and the environment doesn't really change. And while you might be different than the person I speak to next on Zoom, you're not that different as a square on the computer screen. You're different when you're really a human being. So now I have just the same experience kind of all day long that I'm having. So those, I think, are the three biggest reasons why Zoom can be. And then also, as I mentioned, the number of meetings when you're working from home for many organizations has skyrocketed, particularly as we figure out how to do better at asynchronous communication, which we haven't talked too much about, but it's kind of everything we've said. It's about expectations and transparency and over communication. It is easier to have a meeting because you get everyone on the same page quickly, but it requires synchronicity. So we've had this increase in meetings. And of course, that it's talking, it's thinking, it's not getting up to have a cup of coffee or walking around the block, things that rejuvenate you. So that is what's exhausting. And then lastly, introverts and extroverts come to this differently. And if you're an extrovert, you are not getting what you wanted to get from this meeting, which is someone laughing at your jokes or that commiseration or, that feeling of conviviality. And if you're an introvert, you might feel like you're forced into this sort of social experience that puts you on the back foot. You want to turn off your camera. You can't. Are people looking at me? So it's a whole new state of anxieties that for some people might cause them to find stress in it. So yeah, Zoom meetings are tiring. And I think we can talk about what solutions might be. I think being prescriptive, as we've discussed, about who attends meetings and trying to cut down on both their frequency and length. When you can take them in the future from a coffee shop, that would be great. And not everything has to be a Zoom call. Something I talk a lot about in the book is that your voice is a huge deliverer of richness of communication. And humans are very comfortable reading different pitches and tones and pace of speech and understanding from that. And you can get a lot. If you don't have to see someone, if no one's presenting, then you don't need the video necessarily, particularly in one-on-one conversations. And then if you don't need to really take too many notes, and again, you can also get the transcript depending on the tool you're using, can you take a walk? Walking meetings are effective in person. They're also effective on the phone. And that cuts down on your Zoom fatigue. Standing desks, coffee shops, anything you need to mix it up.
I'm kind of rethinking, does this really actually need to be a meeting? Or is this really just something that we can communicate via email, Slack? Or I love screen recordings. Screen recordings are helpful. Am I just trying to train this person to do something? Let me just show them a video. Then they can watch it as many times as they want. And I don't have, whenever they're available. Okay. So I want to ask you the same two questions that I ask everybody. So what does integrity mean to you?
So integrity to me, and I think this is so important for everything we've talked about remote and hybrid work, which is context and transparency. And making sure that what the people around me think they're getting from me is what I think they're getting from me, so that we are on the same page and that I'm giving out as much information as I can and making sure to the best of my ability that it's being received. Not just hoping that what I'm saying is what's hitting their ears, but trying to confirm that, we are on the same page and our information sharing is transparent.
Sure. Do you do that by just asking follow-up questions, or what did you hear me say?
Exactly. Can you rephrase that back to me? Let's put that in writing. It goes back to every communication probably needs to be doubled up, particularly when you're not having in-person communications, though in-person communication would benefit from this as well. All communication would benefit that. But asking people to sort of paraphrase what you've just said is incredibly helpful.
It's not a way of saying, I think you're a child. It's a way of saying, let's make sure that we are on the same page so that we don't have to have another Zoom meeting.
Exactly. And then everyone should be volunteering that on their own. Let me just make sure I heard you right. This is what I'm getting from this, because I can offer that up when I'm getting information and make sure that we're on the same page, and sort of building that into, and it's building it into a culture. This is a culture where we confirm the information we're sharing is known by both parties in the same way.
Yeah. You said two. You said that was contextual, but then what was the other word you said?
Oh, contextual and transparency. So
transparency.
Yeah. And I guess both of those are really the kind of two sides to the same coin. Making sure that you have as much of the information that I can give you as possible. And this goes back to, like, if I'm in a bad mood, I should tell you that I'm in a bad mood. And I want you to get the information from me. And that's about transparency as well. I want to give you as much information as possible, so that you know that I'm doing things from the place from which I think I am doing them, because my biases are always going to come in and your biases are always going to come in. So as much as we can create an environment where again, humans are totally imperfect and flawed, but to the best of our abilities, understand each other's biases.
Having empathy for that, having empathy for us, realizing that we want to care about you. Like, I have empathy for you. I want to care about you. I want to be in a relationship with you. Awesome. Well, what about balance? How do you find balance with all of work and doing that remotely and rest of the life that's happening? How do you find some sort of balance and rhythm in that? What does that look like to you?
I'm going to give an answer that I've never given before, but maybe, it's just a moment in time where my energy comes a lot from discussing digital empathy, and it is work, but it is enjoyable for me. And to try to the best of my ability to align my activities to that enjoyment. Obviously, work is work, and you do things to get paid, and that is part of just existence on this planet Earth. But to put that enjoyment and energy, and really energy, as a North Star, because you can get so much more done the more energy you have. And is this more or less fun than sitting on the couch watching Bridgerton after my kids have gone to bed? Well, yes, I do think talking about digital empathy is more fun than that. So, that means I should continue doing it. And things that don't give me that energy, well, they have to be weighed. Do they contribute to my life in another way, financially? It's
paying attention to your energy levels and where that is, and giving yourself the things that bring you energy, and spending less time with the things that take that
exactly
away. We're trying to work those all in together. Well, you've mentioned several times a book, and I know you have a book coming out. So tell us briefly about that, where we can find it, and how we can get in touch with you.
Yeah. So the book is called How to Win Friends and Manage Remotely. It's all about digital empathy in the workplace. It's coming out in September this fall. I think, I actually was Googling last night, and I think it might be available for pre-order already. But anyways, all of this is available on my website, McKennaSweazey.com. And I have also practical worksheets and stuff that people can download for, like, what you should talk about in your one-on-ones to connect with your direct reports in a way that's not work-oriented, or what team building events are the best for asynchronous teams, stuff like that. So if anyone is interested, or you can follow me on LinkedIn, again, McKenna Sweazey, because I publish a lot on there, and, just the stuff that's coming up in life about how to be good at digital empathy at work.
That's awesome. Well, I am going to keep following this, because it's such an important topic, especially as we're all moving to spending a lot more time on technology. And I'm really glad that you approached this topic, and that you've thought through it so thoroughly and brought us all this really great advice. I'm really honored to talk to you and meet you. Thank you so much for spending this time with us.
It's been great, Kyla. I've had a wonderful time. Let's return to this in a year and see, what happens in the metaverse.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I think, technology, how it changes so quickly. A lot of these, but this conversation is still going to be extremely relevant in a year, especially as we continue to use it more. Technology isn't going away. We're going to keep using it.
No, it is absolutely not.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Such a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for joining me on this journey to grow in our leadership. If you enjoyed this episode, you've got to check out the leadership and self-care coaching programs on my website at kylacofer.com. Let's change the world together.